You've heard the phrase your whole life. Australia was built on the sheep's back. Teachers said it. Your grandparents said it. Politicians still say it every time they visit a regional town and put on an akubra for the cameras. But nobody ever stopped to explain what it actually meant. Not as a metaphor. As a fact. Nobody told you that in 1951, a single bale of Australian wool sold for a price that would make a Sydney property investor blush. Nobody told you that sheep farmers in Western New South Wales were buying luxury cars with cash, building homesteads the size of hotels, and sending their kids to the most expensive boarding schools in the country, all because the world couldn't get enough of what was growing on the backs of their merinos. For decades, wool wasn't just Australia's biggest export. It was Australia's identity. The money that built the roads, funded the railways, and turned colonial outposts into cities came from one place: fleece. And nobody told you what happened next. How the government tried to guarantee that the good times would never end. How they created a system to prop up wool prices when demand started falling. And how that system, built with the best of intentions, ended up creating one of the most spectacular economic disasters this country has ever seen. 4.5 million bales of unsold wool rotting in warehouses. Billions of dollars in debt. An entire industry brought to its knees, not by the market, but by the very mechanism designed to protect it. That's not a failure of wool. That's a failure of understanding. Nobody taught you how commodity booms actually work, why they always end, and what happens when you try to stop the ending. That changes now. By the end of this video, you'll understand the wool boom and bust the way it actually happened. Not as a line in a history textbook. As the single most important economic lesson Australia has ever learned, and the one it's repeating right now with iron ore. You'll see why one animal made this country rich, and why the system built to protect that wealth made the crash 100 times worse. Everything in the wool story comes from two questions. First, how did one animal make an entire country rich? And second, why did the system built to protect wool prices cause the biggest crash? Those two questions have names. The first is the boom, the second is the bust. And by the end of this video, you'll understand both, and you'll see that they were never really two separate things at all. We start with the problem. Before you can understand how wool made Australia rich, you need to understand what Australia was before wool arrived. Go back to the early 1800s. The colony was a financial burden on Britain. It cost more to run than it produced. The land was vast and harsh, and to European eyes, economically useless. There was no obvious cash crop, no sugar like the Caribbean, no tobacco like Virginia, no spices like the East Indies. Australia was a prison with a flag, and London was looking for a reason to keep funding it. Then someone brought merino sheep. And everything changed. The Australian climate, the one that made farming so difficult, turned out to be perfect for wool. Hot, dry conditions produced a fleece that was finer, stronger, and more consistent than anything Europe could grow on its own. British textile mills were hungry for raw material. The Industrial Revolution was spinning cotton and wool into fabric faster than the world had ever seen, and Australia had exactly what they needed in exactly the quantities they wanted. Within a generation, wool went from a side project to the backbone of the entire colonial economy. Squatters pushed inland, claiming millions of acres of grazing land. Entire towns were built around shearing sheds. Wool money funded banks, churches, schools, and parliament houses. By the mid-1800s, Australia wasn't a burden on Britain anymore. It was a supplier, and the product was wool. This is the part that matters. Australia didn't choose wool because it was the best option out of many. It chose wool because it was the only option that worked at scale. And when an entire economy depends on one product that someone else wants to buy, you're not building wealth. You're borrowing it. You're borrowing it from the appetite of the world. And the world changes its appetite. That pattern One country, one product, one buyer has a name. And you need to understand it before anything else in this story makes sense. Before you can understand the boom or the bust, you need to understand the idea that makes both of them possible. That idea is commodity dependence. Here's what commodity dependence means in plain language. When a country's wealth comes mostly from selling one raw material to the rest of the world, that country doesn't control its own fortune. The buyer does. The price of that raw material isn't set in Australia. It's set by how badly someone in London or Beijing or New York wants it. When they want it a lot, the price goes up, money floods in, and everything feels golden. When they stop wanting it, or when they find a cheaper alternative, the price drops, the money dries up, and there's nothing you can do about it. You don't control the tap. Think of it like building your house on the bank of a river. The river feeds you. It irrigates your crops, fills your tanks, gives you everything you need. Life on the riverbank is good, but you didn't build the river. You don't control the rainfall upstream. And one day, the river either dries up or it floods and takes your house with it. Either way, you're at the mercy of something you can't influence. That's commodity dependence. And that's exactly where Australia sat with wool for over a century. The wool was the river. Britain and the rest of the world were the rainfall. As long as the rain kept coming, Australia thrived. But Australia never controlled the rain. This matters because every single thing that happened in the wool story, the boom, the crash, the government intervention, the collapse, all of it traces back to this one idea. When your wealth depends on one thing the world wants, you're only ever one shift in demand away from disaster. Now that you have the foundation, the two tools are straightforward. Here's how the boom actually worked. Wool had been Australia's biggest export for decades, but the real explosion came in 1950. The Korean War broke out. Armies needed uniforms, millions of them. And the best material for military uniforms in extreme conditions, hot days, freezing nights, rain, mud, was wool. Not cotton, not silk, wool, specifically merino wool. And nobody on earth produced merino wool like Australia. What happened next was simple economics. But the scale was extraordinary. Demand surged overnight. The same bale of wool that sold for a modest price in 1949 was suddenly worth 3, 4, 5 times as much. Buyers from the United States military, from Britain, from Europe, were competing against each other at auction houses in Sydney and Melbourne, driving prices through the roof. This is how commodity prices work. When 20 buyers want the same thing and none of them wants to go home empty-handed, the price doesn't rise gradually. It explodes. It's like a livestock auction where every bidder has been told they must not leave without the animal. The auctioneer doesn't set the price, the desperation does. And Australian wool growers were suddenly spectacularly rich. Graziers in Queensland and New South Wales, who had been comfortable but modest, were now among the wealthiest people in the country. There are stories from that era of farmers walking into dealerships and buying cars with cash pulled from a suitcase. Towns that had been quiet pastoral communities were booming. Shearers were in demand. Transport workers were in demand. Every business that touched wool, from the station to the ship, was swimming in money. But the boom wasn't just about the farmers. This is the part most people miss. Every dollar of wool revenue had a multiplier effect. Wool money paid for shearing teams, who spent it in country towns. Country towns grew, which meant more teachers, more builders, more shops. State governments collected more revenue, which funded railways and roads that opened up more land for more sheep. The wool boom didn't just make farmers rich, it built the infrastructure of regional Australia. Roads you drive on today, railway lines you can still trace on a map, towns that exist because someone sheared a sheep nearby 100 years ago. At its peak, wool made up more than half of Australia's total export earnings. Half. One product. from one animal, feeding one economy. That's not diversification, that's a bet. And for decades, it was a bet that paid off magnificently. The merino was the golden goose, Australia was the farm, and the world kept buying. The key point of the boom is this. It wasn't just luck. Australian merino wool genuinely was the best in the world. The climate, the breeding, the expertise, all of it was real. But being the best doesn't protect you when the world decides it wants something else. And that's exactly what started to happen. Here's how the bust worked. It started slowly. Through the 1950s and 60s, something shifted. Synthetic fibers arrived. Nylon, polyester, acrylic. They were cheaper to produce, easier to care for, and fashion was moving away from heavy woolen fabrics towards lighter synthetic blends. Military demand dropped after Korea. Civilian demand started softening. The price of wool, which had been extraordinary, began to slide. Now, if you understand commodity dependence, you know what should happen here. Demand falls, price falls, producers adjust. Some leave the industry, supply contracts. Eventually, a new equilibrium forms at a lower price. It hurts, but it's how markets correct themselves. It's the river dropping, and you move your house back from the bank. But Australia didn't do that. Instead, in 1970, the government and the wool industry created something called the Reserve Price Scheme. The idea was elegant on paper. A floor price was set for wool. If the market price dropped below that floor, a government-backed authority would step in and buy the wool itself, stockpiling it until prices recovered. The thinking was simple. Wool prices go in cycles. If we just hold the wool during the down cycles and sell it during the up cycles, we can smooth out the volatility and protect farmers from the worst of the crashes. It's like holding back the water of a dam with your hands. For a while it works. The pressure is manageable. The water stays where you want it. But the problem with a price floor in a declining market is that it doesn't fix the decline. It hides it. Every time the market said wool is worth less now, the Reserve Price Scheme said no, it isn't, and bought the wool nobody else wanted. Year after year, the stockpile grew. Warehouses across Australia filled with bales that couldn't be sold at the floor price because the world didn't want them at that price. By the late 1980s, the stockpile had reached grotesque proportions. 4.5 million bales sitting in sheds, costing money to store, depreciating in quality, and funded by a growing mountain of debt that the wool industry and ultimately Australian taxpayers were carrying. Then came 1991. The scheme collapsed. The authority couldn't sustain the buying anymore. The floor price was abandoned. And all that stockpiled wool, 4.5 million bales of it, suddenly hit the market at once. The effect was catastrophic. Wool prices didn't just fall, they cratered. Farmers who had been shielded from reality for 20 years were suddenly exposed to a market that had moved on without them. Properties that had been worth millions were worthless. Debt that had been manageable under the floor price was now crushing. The Reserve Price Scheme didn't save the wool industry. It destroyed it. Not because the idea was stupid. Because the idea fought against the most basic force in economics. When demand for something falls, and you refuse to let the price reflect that, you don't prevent the crash. You store it up. You compress it. And when it finally breaks through, the correction is 100 times worse than it would have been if you'd let it happen naturally. The key point of the bust is this. The government didn't cause the decline in wool demand. Synthetic fibers and changing fashion did that. But the government turned a manageable decline into a catastrophic collapse by refusing to let the market adjust. The Reserve Price Scheme was a dam. And in 1991, the dam broke. Here's the part most people never see. The boom and the bust look like two different stories. One is about incredible wealth. The other is about devastating collapse. But they're not two stories. They're the same story told in two chapters. The boom happened because the entire world wanted one Australian product and couldn't get enough of it. The bust happened because the entire world stopped wanting it and found alternatives. The same force that created the wealth, global demand for a single commodity, is exactly the force that destroyed it when that demand shifted. You can't have one without the other. The boom is the bust, waiting to happen. Think about it. If Australia had exported 50 different products in 1950, the Korean War wouldn't have created a boom. Wool would have gone up, sure, but it would have been one line item among many. And when synthetics arrived, wool would have declined, but it would have been one industry adjusting, not an entire economy in crisis. The concentration is what made the boom explosive. And the concentration is what made the bust catastrophic. Same force, same mechanism, same coin, two sides. The reserve price scheme didn't cause the bust. Commodity dependence caused it. The scheme just delayed the reckoning and made the bill astronomically larger. It's like ignoring a leak in your roof because you've put a bucket underneath. The bucket works for a while. But the leak gets worse, and when the bucket overflows, you don't just have a wet floor. You have a ruined house. Once you see this, you can't unsee it. And once you see it, you start noticing the same pattern everywhere in Australia's economic history. Here's what most people get wrong about the wool boom and bust. The first mistake is thinking that synthetic fibers killed wool. They didn't. Synthetics reduced demand, but wool is still produced and exported today. What synthetics did was end wool's monopoly. When wool was the only option, Australia set the terms. When alternatives arrived, the buyers set the terms. Wool didn't die. Its bargaining power did. The second mistake is treating the reserve price scheme as a good idea that was badly executed. It wasn't badly executed. The execution was exactly as planned. The problem was the plan itself. Any system that sets a floor price above the market price in a long-term declining market will accumulate unsold stock until it collapses. That's not a bug. It's the inevitable outcome. The scheme worked perfectly. It just worked perfectly towards disaster. The third mistake is the most dangerous one. Thinking this is ancient history. Thinking it can't happen again. Right now, Australia exports more iron ore than any country on Earth. The biggest buyer is China. Iron ore and related commodities make up a massive share of export revenue. The Australian dollar rises and falls with the iron ore price. Regional towns in Western Australia exist because of mining the same way regional towns in New South Wales existed because of wool. The product changed, the pattern didn't. Let me show you exactly how this knowledge is useful right now. Next time you see a headline saying, "The Australian dollar dropped 2 cents overnight," check the iron ore price. If iron ore fell, your dollar almost certainly fell with it. That's commodity dependence in real time. The same mechanism that linked the Australian pound to wool prices in 1950 links the Australian dollar to iron ore prices today. Next time someone tells you to invest only in the ASX, remember what the wool story teaches about concentration. The ASX is heavily weighted towards mining companies and banks. If you put everything in Australian shares, you're making a concentration bet. The same kind of bet Australia made on wool. Diversifying internationally isn't disloyalty. It's learning from history. Next time a politician promises to protect an industry from market forces through price supports or subsidies, remember the reserve price scheme. There's a difference between helping an industry transition and preventing it from facing reality. One costs money for a few years. The other creates a 4.5 million bale disaster. And next time you hear that Australia has been lucky, that 30+ years without a recession is some kind of miracle, ask yourself what happens when China's appetite for iron ore changes the way the world's appetite for wool changed in the 1960s. Ask yourself whether Australia has learned the lesson the sheep taught it, or whether it's just riding on a different animal's back. Here's what you now know. You know that wool didn't just contribute to the Australian economy. It was the Australian economy for over a century. You know that the boom was driven by global demand for a single commodity, and that the bust was driven by the disappearance of that demand and a government scheme that tried to pretend the disappearance wasn't happening. And you know that the pattern is still alive today. The three most practically useful ideas are these. First, commodity dependence means your wealth is controlled by someone else's appetite, and appetites change. Second, artificial price floors don't prevent crashes. They delay and amplify them, and the correction always comes. Third, and this is the one that matters most, the boom and the bust are the same force. The concentration that makes you rich is the concentration that makes you vulnerable. You can't keep one and avoid the other. The wool boom and bust isn't a history lesson. It's a warning with a new name. The animal changed. The dependence didn't. Next time someone says Australia was built on the sheep's back, you'll know exactly what that means. Not just the wealth, the fragility underneath it. This is general education, not personal financial advice. If you need advice tailored to your situation, speak to a licensed financial advisor.